Hello everyone. Welcome to Postgraduate Education webinar series hosted by HV Desai Eye Hospital. I am Dr. Nikhil Beke, consultant in vitreoretinal surgery and uveitis at HV Desai Eye Hospital.
Dr. Nikhil Beke works as a consultant ophthalmologist in cataract and medical retina at HV Desai Eye Hospital, Pune. He specializes in vitreoretinal diseases as well as uveitis with more than 5 years of experience in his field.
So uveitis, which is basically a form of ocular inflammation. So why not just treat this inflammation with steroids? So there are some very good reasons why we should not be treating all uveitis cases with just steroids. One is the correct and prompt diagnosis can cure the disease. So you'd be curing the disease forever and no further recurrences, no need for further future follow-ups also. Delayed diagnosis can cause irreversible tissue injury. The steroids can worsen the disease burden, especially in cases of infections. Few disorders can have serious systemic association, including malignancies, and a timely diagnosis would help in saving patients' life, not just the eye. And steroids have systemic side effects, both systemic and local side effects, and they can be at times more hazardous than the disease itself. So what is important when you're treating or managing a case of uveitis is a pattern recognition. Let me elaborate on this more. So these are the routine algorithm points when you are trying to make a decision for a uveitis patient. So we typically take a very short history. We undertake a thorough clinical evaluation. We attempt something called as naming and meshing, which I'll be elaborating on further. Then you go back and take retrospective history and do some additional examination if required. And then you order ancillary ophthalmic investigation before the patient leaves your clinic. And then you should be ordering tailored systemic examination and investigations. So these might include some blood workups, some imaging studies like CT scans and X-rays. And it might also include referral to other specialties such as rheumatology or pulmonology or dermatology and so on. So in retrospective history, what further thing is needed apart from the routine history? In retrospective history, you are actually allowed to ask leading questions. For example, if you should be asking history for specific systemic complaints such as headache, backache, lower backache specifically, neck spasm, tinnitus, arthritis, oral ulcers, etc. You should also be asking history of travel, both domestic and international. In terms of medication history, you should also include prior response to treatment and whether any side effects associated with the treatment in the past. For example, the steroid response in terms of IOP. You should also be asking about personal history in terms of addictions, intravenous drug abuse, exposure to pets, and so on, and family history. So I am calling it retrospective history is because not all these points would be relevant in each and every case. And if you find on your examination certain points need to be picked up, you are suspecting certain pathologies for which certain history points would be contributory, you can go back and take some additional history. So this is called as retrospective history. The aim of the workup is to basically build up a pattern, and then you can compare this pattern with certain other known patterns in uveitis to find a perfect fit or near perfect fit. So how do you do that? So you have to gather your information under three heads. One is anatomical involvement, secondly the disease course, and thirdly the disease severity. So anatomical descriptors, as they have been classified by IUSG, International Uveitis Study Group, they include anterior, where the inflammation primarily involves iris and pars plicata; intermediate, where the inflammation predominantly involves pars plana and vitreous; posterior, when the inflammation predominantly involves retina, choroid, optic nerve, either all of them together or in isolation. And then you have panuveitis, when the inflammation is generalized and you can't really pinpoint one particular part of uvea which is predominantly involved. In addition to that, you usually also include quite a few scleritis patients which also land up in a uveitis clinic, but I don't think we will be discussing that today. So always dilate the pupil and examine both eyes. So if you can't see the posterior part of the uvea, then you can take help of additional investigations such as the USGV scan. But whenever feasible, always dilate the pupil. Don't get carried away by saying that it is anterior uveitis before you dilate the patient. Also, it's important to identify the primary site of involvement. What I mean by primary site of involvement is where the quantum of inflammation is at its maximum. There are certain entities such as spillover inflammation. What I mean by that is, suppose you have a very aggressive case of anterior uveitis, you are expected to see few cells in the anterior vitreous just retrolentally, because these are forms of spillover inflammation. This is inflammation which is getting carried over from anterior segment. A part of inflammation is spilling over into anterior part of the posterior segment. You can also have contiguous involvement. What I mean by that is, let's say you have a juxtapapillary patch of toxoplasma retinochoroiditis. You are expected to see some amount of optic nerve head inflammation as well. So this is not optic neuritis. This is basically a contiguous involvement, merely because this structure, the optic nerve head, is in direct contiguity, or it's fairly in vicinity of the other structure, which is the primary source. This distinction is important because you would be treating basically the primary site of involvement. You would be treating the toxoplasma retinochoroiditis in this case, and not the optic nerve head inflammation. That would take care of itself. So when it comes to temporal descriptors of disease course, what I mean by temporal descriptors is depending on time. So we have two heads, duration and separation between the two episodes. So when you have duration of a particular episode, if it's getting over within 3 months or less, then you would call it limited in duration. If it's taking more than 3 months to clear away, then it would be a persistent in duration episode. Also, the separation between the two episodes of treatment, if your patient is able to manage staying off the medications and is able to have a quiet course of inflammation for less than or equal to 3 months, then it would be called chronic. And if it's extending beyond 3 months, then it would be called recurrent. This terminology is important because when you're describing these findings to your colleagues over, let's say, internet, or when you're publishing your data in uveitis journals, then this is the standard terminology as defined by SUN. You also have the disease severity scale. So this is the ordinal scale on which you would be putting your inflammation. So this ranges from 0 to 4+. This has both AC cells and AC flare, and you have a very standardized way of assessing these cells and flare. This serves two purposes. One is, as I said, this has a great utility in communication. So if you're trying to communicate it to other colleagues or for publications, this would be useful in documenting the severity. And this also has direct clinical utility also. Suppose you start treating a patient with 4+ cells, and with your treatment, your patient successfully decreases his inflammation to 1+. Then we can presume that your treatment is working. So during the follow-up visits of these patients, it's important that you document your findings on a standardized grade. So in terms of disease course, you have onset descriptors such as acute and insidious. Then you have recurrent descriptors where your disease is coming back again and again. So you need to find out whether the recurrent episodes, are they always involving the same eye, or are they bilateral? So are they alternating, that first the right eye is getting involved, then the left eye, then again the right eye, and so on. In terms of chronic disorders, you need to distinguish between unilateral and bilateral entities. And in cases of bilateral involvement, you need to find out whether it's a sequential involvement, as in the right eye getting involved first and then the left eye and then back to the right eye. So it might be sequential in the sense that simultaneously both the eyes wouldn't be active at the same time. Or is this symmetrical? So if the bilateral involvement is there, are both eyes more or less having the similar scale of severity, or one eye is predominantly more inflamed than the other? So then you have pathological descriptors, which include granulomatous versus non-granulomatous. So this is typically in terms of keratic precipitates that you speak of, as in the right image here. So any keratic precipitate that has a volume, that has some thickness, that would be called as granulomatous, and a dust-like endothelial streaming would be categorized as non-granulomatous. You can also see granulomatous inflammation in terms of the iris nodules, which is relatively less common. And then you can classify the disease in terms of etiology. So broadly speaking, the etiologies get classified into infectious, secondly non-infectious or immune etiologies, and then you have masquerade syndrome, typically involving malignancies, which mimic inflammation, but these are actually malignancies. So what is this naming and meshing? So naming is combining all the descriptors which we have discussed so far to form a pattern for this case. And then the meshing compares this pattern with known set of patterns and we try to find a closer fit. And then we form the differential diagnosis depending on the pattern that we have at hand. So let me give you an example. So you have a 30-year-old man from Pune complaining of right-sided redness since last 1 week with blurred vision and pain and photophobia. The complaint started suddenly on last Sunday morning. The patient can even tell you the time that they started at about 9 a.m. and have continued ever since. So this has happened in past, has always involved the right eye, maybe about once in 6 months for last few years, and typically goes away in a week or so, even without pain. But this time the attack is much worse. On examination, iritis with hypopyon and filiform posterior synechiae could be seen. You can also see the pigment on the anterior lens surface and some fibrin in the pupillary area. So on specific questioning, that is the retrospective history, he answers affirmatively to the presence of low backache and morning stiffness. So when it comes to naming, you have a 30-year-old male patient. So this is a patient identifier. Then in terms of the onset of the disease, you have acute in onset. This is the course. Then you have anterior, this is the anatomical descriptor, uveitis. Then you have hypopyon, which indicates the severity. So this is limited in duration for the past episode. This is non-granulomatous. This is a pathological descriptor. Then you have past episodes which are recurrent because these are coming back again and again. And the distance between the two episodes is more than 3 months. And then you have unilateral, because this has always been affecting only one eye. And then you have additional info in terms of low backache and morning stiffness. So the meshing, this naming, this compilation of the descriptors would give, which is going to give you a pattern. And then you are going to try to match this pattern with similar patterns. So the similar patterns include HLA-B27 associated uveitis, such as ankylosing spondylitis, psoriasis, reactive arthritis, Reiter syndrome, so on. So this is the difference between the differential diagnosis and the meshing patterns. So the differential diagnosis is only for one single sign. Suppose you have hypopyon uveitis in this case. So the hypopyon uveitis would give you so many differential diagnoses, and it would be rather inefficient to keep on investigating for each of these causes. But instead, you can form a pattern which, in addition to hypopyon uveitis, has some more data, such as low backache and morning stiffness, a young male patient. So this points towards HLA-B27 associated uveitis. So this helps right away with shortlisting your list of differential diagnosis. So is this all about nothing? I mean, is this naming and meshing, Sun classification, IUSC classification, is this only for researchers and academicians, or does it have any direct clinical utility? So let me digress somewhat and tell you about these things. These are the street posters in UK and India respectively. On the left hand side, the UK poster says if you have cough for more than 3 weeks, it might be cancer, might be lung cancer. On the right hand side, you have no less than Amitabh Bachchan telling us that if you have TB for more than 2 weeks, then probably it's TB. So it's very easy to follow that different geographic populations have different diseases and therefore different investigations and therefore different treatments. So similarly, it's not that difficult to follow that if you have a population of acute anterior uveitis and another population of retinal vasculitis, these two distinct groups, these two distinct populations are going to have different disorders or different diseases, so different investigations and different treatments. So don't try to treat all your uveitis patients only with steroids or one single treatment, and don't try to investigate all your uveitis patients as if it's a single disease. So this is a complex mix of multiple disorders, and you are trying to sort of form patterns and narrow down the list of differential diagnoses. So it's the next in continuation is these different population have different disorders, so do different tests. So don't order a single standard set of investigation for all your uveitis patients. This runs multiple risks. So if you do that, for the beginners, this is very irrelevant. You are likely to pick up irrelevant results if you order irrelevant tests. This is also somewhat an inefficient way of doing it. One of the brilliant examples that I read about was from this answer by Dr. Alfredo Sadun, the neuro-ophthalmologist, on the website Quora. So he gives an example of urine pregnancy test in male population. So urine pregnancy test is a very good test. It's a fairly accurate test. But if you do it in the wrong population, then it might give you very irrelevant results. And for those of you who say that it's simply not possible to get a positive urine pregnancy test, it is very much possible. You have some testicular tumors where it could be false positive, and those false positive results could be misleading because they take you away from the potential diagnosis. They are quite confusing at times. These are at times red herrings which take you away from the original diagnosis, and at times you can't simply make head or tails of what the additional information is telling you. And they are potentially dangerous because these false positive results might actually lead you to over investigate a patient. It might also lead to over treat a patient, and at times that treatment might have more side effects than the original disease itself. Similarly, it needs to be remembered that even in a right population, such as pregnant females, a false negative result could also be feasible, and that could also be misleading, confusing, and potentially dangerous. For example, a negative urine pregnancy test in an ectopic pregnancy lead to disastrous consequences if the obstetrician didn't remember that it's very much possible to get a negative urine pregnancy test even when there is an active pregnancy going on, intra-abdominal pregnancy going on. So similar things can happen, for example, in cases of Toxoplasma retinochoroiditis. So if your IgM and IgG is negative, doesn't mean that your patient doesn't have the disease. It simply means that the test could be false negative. So don't get carried away by a negative serology test for Toxoplasma retinochoroiditis, and don't aggressively try to treat this patient with steroids. That could lead to a disaster. So this is something of an additional info. So this speaks volumes about the test and the hope that you have that merely ordering more tests would lead you somehow to the diagnosis. So this is a nomogram. This looks complicated. Let me simplify this for you. At times it might be slightly on the side of oversimplification, but you have on the left-hand side something called as pre-test probability. So after seeing the patient, after clinically examining the patient, as a clinician, how confident are you that this particular patient has a particular disease? So if you feel that there is a 90% likelihood that this patient has ocular tuberculosis, so there is only 10% possibility that this person has VKL. So these are the clinical estimates that you make even subconsciously at times. So what it takes is basically a systematized clinical acumen, and also knowing that your community, your population, the population that you cater to has a particular prevalence of a particular disease. So your population is also riddled with certain risk factors, which makes your population more prone to a particular disease. And then systematically employing naming and meshing techniques or similar techniques can make you fairly confident about absence or presence of a particular disease in a given case. Then you order certain diagnostic tests. And there is a parameter called as likelihood ratio, which roughly speaking compiles the results of sensitivity and specificity for that test. So this likelihood ratio it doesn't get influenced by the prevalence of a certain disease in your population. This is an independent parameter. So this has something to do with sensitivity and specificity of the test, and broadly speaks about the accuracy of this test. So when you compile the information collected from your clinical evaluation and your diagnostic test, if you put them together, you get something called as post-test probability, which is your final verdict. So compiling the data together at the end of the evaluation, how confident are you that your patient has or doesn't have a particular disease? So the post-test probability. So what this figure actually tells you, this tells you that if you have a high pre-test probability, then no matter which test you order, even a low sensitivity test would confirm your diagnosis and your post-test probability would be high. But if you have a low test probability to begin with, even one of the most sensitive tests is also not going to make the likelihood any further. So when it comes to post-test probability, it makes sense. If you have a very high test probability, any ordinary test is going to confirm your diagnosis for you. So the choice of the test matters, but what matters is a prior clinical acumen. So does that mean that the investigation should not be done at all? And I'm specifically talking in terms of systemic evaluation. I'm not talking in terms of the imaging investigations that will be done inside your own clinic. So the investigations are very much needed for three purposes. One is to find the etiology. So this may help in ruling out the infections as well. Secondly, for assessing systemic associations, for example, sarcoidosis. And this is also for assessing the systemic activity. Does your disease simply localize to the eye, or does it also have some systemic associations and a systemic disease to treat? So these investigations should always be preceded by thorough clinical evaluation to find out which are the tests that you need to order. For example, in the case of sarcoidosis, you would be ordering only CT scan of the chest rather than any other test. And for fitness of systemic treatment, for example, if you're planning to put your patient on immunosuppression, just to see if your liver and kidneys are functioning well, if the hemogram is normal, if the bone marrow is functioning well, you'll be ordering certain tests for assessing the fitness for systemic treatment. So when it comes to anterior uveitis, you have juvenile idiopathic arthritis. So all that you need to order is ANA and not any other test. And when it comes to acute anterior non-granulomatous uveitis with low backache in a young male, then the only test that you need to order is HLA-B27. When you are seeing signs like reduced corneal sensitivity, iris atrophy, recurrent episodes of keratouveitis with at times scleritis, then the diagnosis is more or less obvious that you're dealing with a herpetic etiology, and you can have no tests whatsoever, or still in doubt, you can do an aqueous tap for viral PCR. But no further tests such as Mantoux test and other tests are really required. So if you have clear-cut history of trauma and your clinical evaluation is fairly consistent with the possibility of blunt trauma, then no further tests are required. For Fuchs uveitis, you don't really require further tests. All that you need to have is enough confidence in your clinical acumen. For Behçet's disease, it's more or less most of the times it's a clinical diagnosis. So HLA-B51 is rarely available and it's more for academic purposes. But even a strongly positive HLA-B51 test in absence of the clinical symptoms would not mean much. So for Behçet's disease is again a clinical diagnosis. So for a large majority of anterior uveitis cases, you should be able to make a diagnosis at the end of few basic investigations and a thorough clinical evaluation. So not too many investigations are needed, and if you over-investigate, you are likely to catch up some red herrings. So in terms of intermediate uveitis, you need to look up at the list of possible differential diagnoses that you have. So when it comes to TB or sarcoidosis, then a Mantoux test would be valuable. A strongly positive Mantoux test would point towards tuberculosis. But a negative Mantoux test, what I mean by negative is absolutely no induration at all, would suggest anergy because of the sarcoidosis. When it comes to sarcoidosis, rather than doing a chest X-ray, it would be more useful if you do a high-resolution contrast-enhanced CT scan. For syphilis, VTRL and TPHA tests have to be done, and I in fact recommend that you do it for most of your uveitis cases because syphilis is known to be a great masquerader. So it can come up in any form, anterior, intermediate, and posterior. When it comes to masquerades, which come up with large cells in the vitreous, you are suspecting lymphoma, then none of the systemic blood workup is really going to help you much. It's actually the diagnostic vitrectomy and sending that vitreous specimen for cytopathology is actually going to be much more useful in terms of diagnosing and treating the disease. So it needs to be remembered that a large majority of the intermediate uveitis cases can be idiopathic. So if you have large areas of snow banking and if you can't find a diagnosis, it would be called as sparse planitis and treated as such. So don't go on chasing a disease if most of the common etiologies have been ruled out. When it comes to posterior uveitis, the matters are a little more complex because you have more than one anatomical structures getting involved. For example, retinal vasculitis, which although not part of the uvea, commonly gets classified under posterior uveitis. So when it comes to working up of a case of retinal vasculitis, it absolutely is important to rule out non-infectious or non-uveitic disorders which are causing perivascular exudation. For example, diabetic retinopathy and Coats disease, which have got nothing to do with ocular inflammation, but they mimic uveitis at times, they mimic retinal vasculitis at times. A large majority of these cases, retinal vasculitis cases, may be idiopathic. So systemic investigations can help more only if there are clinical signs of systemic disease are present. For example, if you have a case of, let's say, Wegener's granulomatosis, if the clinical signs are absent, your ANA test and ANCA tests are likely to be negative. You just have a retinal vasculitis and if you're suspecting Wegener's granulomatosis. These slides for a quick. So when it comes to posterior uveitis, you have a more complicated disease to investigate because you have multiple anatomical structures which are variably getting involved. When it comes to retinal vasculitis, it's important to rule out non-uveitic disorders which cause, I'm really sorry for the mistake there, it's non-uveitic disorders causing perivascular exudation. For example, as would happen with diabetic retinopathy or as would happen with retinal vein occlusions or even Coats disease. So these are non-uveitic entities. They simply mimic a case of retinal vasculitis. So that should not lead you astray from the right diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy and Coats disease. So your clinical acumen is going to come handy here. So a large majority of the retinal vasculitis cases may be idiopathic, and systemic investigations only help if you have clinical signs of systemic disease. So randomly ordering, let's say, a collagen vascular workup for all your patients of retinal vasculitis might just be, you might be doing excessive tests without getting any concrete, any useful additional information. It might also be useful to classify your patients of retinal vasculitis into two categories, predominantly veins involved, predominantly arteries involved, because the list of differential diagnosis in these two categories, it's quite different. When it primarily involves the veins, you are thinking of in terms of TB and sarcoidosis, and you'll be ordering tests like Mantoux test and HRCT or CECT test. And when it predominantly involves the arteries, you are thinking in terms of collagen vascular disorders such as SLE or polyarteritis nodosa or even Behçet's disease. So the investigations that are required. So saying that just the patient has retinal vasculitis is not enough. You need to also classify it as veins and arteries. And you can also take help of FFA or ICG to find out is this retinal vasculitis occlusive or non-occlusive. So that might also help. So when it comes to retinitis and choroiditis, when you have a very obvious disease which has no systemic correlates, for example, Vogt-Koyanagi-Harada syndrome or sympathetic ophthalmia, then no systemic investigations honestly need to be ordered for diagnosis. They can be ordered for planning immunosuppression, but not for diagnosis. So when you have certain entities which are known to have certain systemic correlates, for example, if you have serpiginous-like or serpiginoid choroiditis, especially with periphlebitis, especially with associated retinal vasculitis, then you are thinking in terms of TB, and the test to order would be a Mantoux test plus minus chest imaging. So when you have retinitis, it's important to rule out infections, including HIV. I have seen disasters happening when a patient of CMV retinitis actually got misdiagnosed as a case of autoimmune uveitis and was bombarded with steroids only to have the CMV retinitis progressing to retinal detachment. So if you are suspecting worsening despite of giving steroids, then think of infections such as viral infections and syphilis or fungal or toxoplasma retinochoroiditis. So when you have when you order serologies such as Torch titers, I oftentimes see my uveitis, posterior uveitis patient come up with a large list of serologies such as Torch titers. So remember, those serology is not by itself is not really contributory. So if you have a case of diagnostic dilemma, it's very rare that the serology would actually add on to your information. So the only exception being HIV, because in HIV, the certain opportunistic infections might come up and their picture might be very different than what would be described in the textbook, such as Toxoplasma retinochoroiditis. So HIV serology actually adds on to your diagnosis a lot, but the other serologies such as Torch titers, they don't really add much of a value. Thank you.